Okay, so this is chapter 6, part 3. Again, still talking about metabolism. And in this part of the chapter, we're going to focus on short-term energy storage molecules, ATP. That'll be our main focus. And then I'll briefly talk again about NADH. I mentioned them in the part 1 video. And again, you're going to see these molecules again as we talk about cellular respiration and photosynthesis. And so I wanted to just give you a little bit more about each one before getting to those chapters. So again, we've mentioned ATP a few times in a couple of different chapters. And so again, what ATP is, first of all, it stands for adenosine triphosphate. Okay, and so ATP, it's a small, relatively simple molecule, and it's a safe and effective way for our cells to store energy for short periods of time. We consider it, I'm going to skip down to the third bullet point here, we consider it to be the primary energy currency of our cells. And so again, any process that requires energy, so like active transport or the buildup of larger molecules, so anabolic processes, those types of processes require energy. It's going to come in the form of ATP, usually. Okay? When we look at the structure of ATP, it's made up of adenosine, which is composed of adenine here, and the sugar ribose, and then 1, 2, 3 phosphate groups that are sometimes called 1, 2, and 3, and sometimes they're called alpha, beta, and gamma phosphate groups. Depends on what book you're reading. Okay? The bonds between the phosphate groups have energy. And that's stored potential energy, short-term storage. Your cells aren't going to store energy for long periods in this form, just for short periods. We say that ATP functions kind of like a rechargeable battery, and on the next slide I'll actually show you this. So what happens is this third phosphate group called the gamma phosphate group, this will come off. It's actually going to come off and be donated to whatever cellular process this ATP is driving. And that transfer of that phosphate group is a transfer of energy. And so then if this third phosphate group comes off, then we're left with ADP, adenosine diphosphate. And that third phosphate group can be put back on if there is a process, a catabolic process happening in cells that releases energy. That will cause this terminal last gamma phosphate, third phosphate group, to be put back on. So let me show you that rechargeable battery analogy. So here we go. When we have exergonic catabolic reactions that take place in our cells, like cellular respiration, which we're going to get to in the next chapter, these types of processes we say release energy. And so what does that exactly mean? So those types of processes will cause the third phosphate group, which here it's labeled PI, so that stands for inorganic phosphate. It will cause this phosphate group to be added back onto ADP to form ATP. So when we say energy is released, that's what's happening. That last phosphate's being put back onto ADP to form ATP. And then any processes that require work, so any endergonic reactions that require energy, so anabolic reactions or transport, active transport that require energy, what's going to happen is that ATP, the last phosphate group, is going to come off and actually be given to whatever it's driving. That represents an energy transfer, and we are left with, in the end, adenosine diphosphate and inorganic phosphate. And the process continues. So that last phosphate can be put on to form ATP. It can be taken off to form ADP. Okay, so again, it's kind of like a rechargeable battery. So again, I already mentioned this, but here's the structure. So again, it's composed of adenosine. So adenosine is a nucleotide made up of adenine and this sugar here called ribose, and then 3 phosphate groups. And again, you can label them 1, 2, and 3, or alpha, beta, gamma. Either way is perfectly fine. It's that terminal third or gamma phosphate that represents the transfer of energy. So that last phosphate group can come off and can be put on and can come off and can be put on. And when that happens, that energy is being transferred. So let's take a peek at that. Okay, so shown here is the transfer of that last phosphate. And so this is going to require water. It's a hydrolysis reaction. So here is ATP, right? So adenine, ribose make up adenosine, and then phosphate group 1, 2, and 3. Okay, here it is in more simple skeleton form. So again, adenine, ribose, 3 phosphate groups. Water will come in, that terminal last phosphate will come off, and that's represented here by Pi, which stands for inorganic phosphate. Here we're left with ADP, adenosine diphosphate, 2 phosphate groups. So when this happens, when this last phosphate comes off, that's the energy that gets released. Okay, and again, that's the energy that can then drive whatever cellular work needs that energy. Okay, so let's talk about what needs that energy. So I've mentioned this a few times. And so here we have a process that this ATP can be used to drive. And so this is called energy coupling. And so in this case, ATP is going to be used. First of all, it's produced by an exergonic reaction, right? And then here it's going to be used to drive an endergonic anabolic reaction, a buildup reaction. Okay, and so here we go. This is going to be the process by which sucrose, which is a disaccharide, will be produced. So here we have ATP, and when it gets hydrolyzed, right, so ATP plus water is going to yield ADP plus inorganic phosphate. This process of removing that last phosphate is going to have a delta G. I usually use this second number. A delta G of negative 7.3 kilocalories per mole. So what does that mean? So the change in free energy is negative, right? So this process of hydrolyzing ATP is exergonic. It's energy releasing. It's catabolic, right? We're breaking down that molecule. And that energy that gets released, again, if it is negative enough, it could drive a process that requires, either that amount or less than that amount of energy. So this negative 7.3 kilocalories per mole represents the amount of energy that gets released during this process. So forming sucrose, right, we're going to have the 2 monosaccharides, glucose and fructose. They're going to get put together to form sucrose, and water is released. This process is anabolic, it's endergonic. So the change in free energy, the amount of energy needed to drive this process, I always do kilocalories per mole, is positive 6.5 kilocalories per mole. Okay? And so if we do the math here, if we combine the two, so glucose plus fructose plus ATP, that'll yield sucrose plus ADP plus PI. That has an overall delta G, an overall free energy change of negative 1.2 kilocalories per mole. And so as long as the delta G is still negative, that process can run. So we say we can couple the breakdown of ATP to the formation of sucrose. And as long as that change in free energy is still negative, then both processes can run. Okay? So that's the kind of the math and the formulas behind it. What is actually happening? So let's look here. So what's actually happening is ATP gets hydrolyzed, and that last phosphate, that terminal phosphate, actually gets donated to glucose. So again, there's this transfer of the phosphate is really the transfer of energy. And so we end up with, after that first part of the reaction, we end up with phosphorylated glucose plus ADP. Now that phosphorylated glucose can combine with fructose to form sucrose, and we end up with that inorganic phosphate coming off of the glucose molecule. So again, here, a transfer of energy happens due to the transfer of that phosphate group. The energy from that bond in between the second and third phosphate group of ATP is transferred to glucose. So again, that's called energy coupling. And so again, exergonic reactions can drive endergonic reactions as long as the change in free energy is still negative overall. I wanted to give you one other example of a process that ATP drives. So it's not just endergonic reactions, but ATP also powers things like active transport. And we've already seen active transport back in chapter 5. And so the same thing here, this should look familiar. This is the phospholipid bilayer. And this right here is the sodium-potassium pump. We looked at this back in chapter 5. It's an active transporter. It pumps or pushes 3 sodium ions out of the cell against their concentration gradient and pumps 2 potassium ions into the cell, again, against that electrochemical gradient. And so where does ATP come in? ATP down here is going to, again, transfer its phosphate group, driving this pump, and eventually you end up with ADP and PI. Okay, so that energy gets used by this pump. Okay, so ATP again powers all kinds of cellular work. It could be energy coupling, it can be active transport. ATP is going to be that main molecule involved. Okay. So at the end of this part of our talk, again, I want to mention NADH. And I need to mention it because, again, in photosynthesis and in cellular respiration, we are going to be talking about energy transformations and ATP being produced or used. And all of these are all, coordinated chemical pathways, and they involve redox reactions. And so when we talk about redox reactions, we're talking about transfer of electrons. And so that's where NADH is going to come into play. Okay, so energy in living systems, so our cells, when we talk about these energy transformations, again, we're going to have coordinated chemical pathways. It's not just a simple, formula, even though we sum it up that way, but there's really going to be a bunch of little steps along the way, and those steps, a lot of times, are going to be redox reactions. So what is that? So a redox reaction, redox stands for reduction oxidation, and so you have both a reduction and an oxidation occurring in a redox reaction. So what does it mean? What is a reduction? And what is an oxidation? So whatever molecule in the reaction is losing electrons, we say gets oxidized. And whatever molecule gains the electrons, we say gets reduced. And I always remember this as Leo the lion goes grr. So Leo, lose electrons, oxidized. The lion goes grr, grr, gain electrons, reduced. That helps me remember who's losing, who's gaining. Okay? When there is a loss of electrons, so when there is an oxidation, the molecule that's being oxidized, that's losing electrons, is also losing potential energy. The molecule that is being reduced or gaining electrons is gaining potential energy. So when we think about electrons are potential energy. And so again, make sure that you make that connection. When you hear electron, I want you to think energy. So again, when a molecule loses an electron, it loses some energy. When a molecule gains an electron, it gains that energy. Okay, so again, the transfer of an electron is equal to a small transfer of energy. When we talk about these complex chemical pathways, again, there's going to be these redox reactions that happen at different places along the way. And so we say that energy transfer, this transfer of electrons, occurs in kind of small, incremental, manageable steps which allows the energy to be harnessed instead of being released all at once in one burst. Okay, so for example, when we look at cellular respiration, we're going to say that glucose, gets oxidized. It's going to lose electrons to form, carbon dioxide and water. That doesn't happen just like that in one step. It happens in these small incremental steps along the pathway. So we'll talk about glycolysis, and then we'll talk about the citric acid cycle, and then we'll talk about the electron transport chain. There are these small incremental steps that electrons get transferred. Again, instead of, you don't want to just take glucose and strip electrons off, because that you're not going to be able to harness all that energy all at once. Well, let me show you a little bit of an analogy. And so here we've got this big boulder, and this big boulder represents energy. Okay, and so if I were at the top of a hill, or in this case a staircase or whatever, and I had this boulder, and there wasn't incremental steps. Instead, there was just this big drop off, and I pushed the boulder over, right? That boulder is going to go from having a high amount of potential energy to low potential energy very quickly. Okay? Look at the other side of this figure where there are steps. So this person's going to push the boulder, and the boulder's going to kind of bounce at each step. And as it bounces, it's going to lose a little bit of energy over time. Okay? Same thing happens in chemical pathways like cellular respiration. So again, glucose doesn't just quickly get all the energy pulled out of it all at once. That would be an unmanageable, literally a burst of energy. Instead, what happens is that energy is stripped off of glucose a little bit at a time in the form of electrons. And so therefore, the energy can be harnessed. And again, it's not 100% efficient, but the process is pretty good. And again, we get a lot more energy out of glucose that way than we would if the reaction looked more like what's happening here on the left. So that brings us to NADH. Okay, so NADH and its two cousins, NADPH and FADH2, you'll see those three molecules when we go over cellular respiration and photosynthesis. NADH is the we're going to see that the most out of those three, and so that's why I mentioned it here. NAD is going to be the molecule that is going to be responsible for taking those high energy electrons at multiple steps in these pathways, grabbing them and shuttling them or bringing them to the very last stage, if we're talking about cellular respiration, the very last stage of cellular respiration. So you can think of NADH as an electron shuttling molecule. Its job is to bind and carry high energy electrons between compounds and pathways. Okay, so as we're stripping electrons off of glucose, NAD, which once it grabs those electrons will become NADH, that's the reduced form. NADH, as it's holding those high energy electrons, it's going to shuttle or carry them to different parts in the pathway. Okay, so again, keep that in mind. So NADH represents a molecule that is responsible for transporting high energy electrons, which represent energy, from one part of a pathway to another. And so really quickly, I don't need you to really understand the structure. What I do need you to understand is that NAD plus is the oxidized form, and NADH is the reduced form. So NADH will be the form that actually has those electrons that it's carrying. Once NADH gives up those electrons, it becomes oxidized to form NAD+. And this is another molecule, just like ATP, that kind of functions as a rechargeable battery, right? It gains electrons, it loses electrons. It gains electrons, it loses electrons. So it can be used over and over again for this job. Okay, so again, make sure that you have a general understanding of ATP and NADH, because again, we're going to see these molecules when we get into cellular respiration, and then again when we get into photosynthesis.